Sup, and welcome to a random review of The Last Duel, which is just something I felt like putting together out of nowhere. Will I do another one of these? I don't know. That's what makes it random. Also, just a heads up that this movie is about very graphic subject matter. It's about sexual assault, so if you're not in the right headspace to hear about a movie that's about that right now, now you know. So, I saw this in a theater, and this is normally not the type of movie that I'd go out and see, especially in the middle of a pandemic, but I made an exception because I remember reading the book this movie was based on back when I was in school, and I remember really liking the book. In the book and this movie, there were these two well-connected French soldiers in the 14th century named Gris and Carrouge, and they were friends for most of their lives, but then things started to take a turn between them. And then one day, Carrouge's wife alleged that Gris came over to their estate and raped her. And Carrouge, in reaction to this, challenged Gris to a duel to the death. And it takes place in a field in front of a bunch of spectators. And it's based on real events, and this was the last officially sanctioned duel to the death in France that was accepted by the French legal system. And that's why the movie is called The Last Duel. Although the movie, I think, could have done a better job of explaining why it's called The Last Duel, because it doesn't really go into all those specifics, but anyway. The movie does a good job of capturing a lot of what was in the book. For instance, one thing I always remembered about the book was that before Carrouge and Gris dueled, the officiator for the event gave out these rules to the crowd, and at one point he said something like, "Wizardry will not be allowed from anyone in the stands. No spells are to be cast today." And that always stood out to me because I remember thinking, wow, people still thought wizards were real back then. Like, that's how primitive people were in 1386. And in the beginning of this movie, they actually retained that line. You can actually hear it right before the duel. And it's such a small detail, but I love that the movie kept it. I think it's good to put it out there that the reason countries used to have official duels to the death is because they were so back-asswards that they still believed in magic and thought that brutal violence was the best way to solve legal disputes like this. Beyond that, the movie looks great. The sets and the costumes are all very authentic looking. There are also these very short battles that you get to see in the film between, like, rival factions, and they're not there for long, but when they're there, they're pretty awesome. As far as accuracy goes, the movie does the Chernobyl thing, where even though this movie takes place in France, everyone is speaking English, and not only are the characters speaking English, they're not even trying to adopt a French accent, like, they sound more British than anything, but you know, it's a movie, you just kind of accept it after a while. Adam Driver, aka Kylo Ren, is very good as Gris, and Matt Damon is very good as Carrouge. Ben Affleck, on the other hand, is in this as Gris's nobleman friend, and I thought Ben Affleck was terrible in this. Ben Affleck can be a good actor, I have seen him be a good actor, but if you stick him in a costume, I'm sorry, it just doesn't work. I found him distractingly off in this. The best actor in the movie, though, is Jodie Comer, who plays Carrouge's wife, Marguerite, and she was awesome in this, especially since the movie becomes about her towards the end. So, here's the thing with this story. In the book, it is a mystery as to whether or not Gris really raped Carrouge's wife. If you had to guess, you'd probably say he did it, but you don't know for certain. You're going off of conflicting reports from the 1300s, so who knows what's reliable. And so, that was one of the fascinating elements of this duel, that it was supposed to legally decide whether or not Gris was guilty. If Carrouge won, it would have been deemed that Gris really did it and deserved to die, whereas if Gris won, it would have been deemed that he was innocent, and that as a result of that, Carrouge's wife would then be burned at the stake for lying. In the movie, however, it's a little different. In the movie, they tell the story from each of the three main characters' perspectives, 𝗥𝗍, Carrouge, and Carrouge's wife. So you watch the same events play out 3 times, but you see it from their points of view. And so you think it's going to be like Rashomon. You think the perspectives are going to be different and opposing, and you're not going to know definitively what's true or not. Except that that's the exact opposite of what happens in this movie. Because in this movie, everyone's perspectives pretty much align with each other perfectly. And in fact, you actually see 𝗥𝗍 rape Carrouge's wife from 𝗥𝗍's perspective. So there is no mystery in this. The movie straight up puts it out there that 𝗥𝗍 really did this. And it's weird that the movie made that decision because without the element of mystery, there's no reason why we had to see these events play out 3 separate times. The Last Duel is very long. It is 2.5 hours long. And way too much of the runtime is spent backtracking to retell the same scenes that you watched 20 minutes ago. Like, you have to watch some of these scenes multiple times. For instance, you have to watch 𝗥𝗍 rape Carrouge's wife, Marguerite, twice from different angles. And it's totally unnecessary, and it bloats the runtime. That doesn't mean it's not an interesting way to deliver this story, since each perspective gradually fills us in on where each character is coming from, but because everyone's side meshes so cleanly with each other, there's no reason why this movie couldn't have been told in real time through everyone's perspectives simultaneously, like a typical movie would have done. If I had to speculate, I think it's very possible that Rashomon was on the minds of the people who wrote this movie, because Rashomon is very famous and a classic, and not only is it the definitive movie that's told from different people's points of view, it's also about an alleged rape. And so I could see a scenario where the people making The Last Duel were like, we want to tell the story from different people's points of view, but if we have everyone's points of view be wildly conflicting, critics are just going to compare us to Rashomon, and they're going to say we're ripping it off. So let's just get rid of that conflict and make everyone's side more or less coalesce with each other. But that takes something out of the film, not just because it makes it way longer than it needs to be, but because when you watch the duel at the end, there's now a giant reason for us to not root for 𝗥𝗍, on top of the fact that Carrouge's wife would also die if Carrouge died in the duel. Now that said, not all of the creative licenses that the movie takes are a bad thing. One of the things it does is it makes Carrouge's wife way more of a present figure. And the last third of the movie is basically all about her. And I really like the last part of this movie. And as dark as some of the subject matter is, The Last Duel actually works around to take on a bit of a feminist angle towards the end. It becomes about how horrible it was to be a woman back then, and how if you were a woman and you were raped, it was only a crime because it was an offense against the husband. Women were considered property back then. And even though we're shown that 𝗥𝗍 was guilty, according to the film, we are also shown that Carrouge was not a great person himself. And so, even if her husband won the duel, it's laid out that her living situation was going to be terrible either way. And when the last duel takes place, you wind up asking yourself, deep down, which outcome is preferable to her? Does she want to keep living in this awful world that she's been born into, or would she rather die? And it's cool that the movie manages to ask that without it being overblown. At the same time, the execution of this is not perfect. There is subtext that the movie puts out there about Carrouge's wife that you could easily interpret as her wanting 𝗥𝗍 to win for sexual reasons, which is not great. There's a big point of emphasis in this movie on the sex life between Carrouge and his wife, and the misogynistic attitudes that people had about sex and pregnancy at the time. And there's some historical accuracy to it. Like, people really thought those things back then. But the film focuses on it so much that it becomes this thing where you're like, are you showing us this because you want us to know what it was like back then? Or are you showing us this because you want us to incorporate the wrong things that people believed as the reason for why certain things are actually happening? Because if that's the case, it's a very awkward message to send to an audience that knows better. And to me, that's emblematic of the trade-off that this movie makes. By putting it out there that Legris raped Carrouge's wife, by not even having Legris's side be warped and fictitious about it, beyond him publicly proclaiming his innocence anyway, it makes Marguerite de Carrouge more immediately sympathetic, and it makes her a more active, present player in this story, which is a good thing. But the film struggles to balance that story change in a way that's proportional, in a way where there aren't these tendrils from the men's perspectives that don't get in the way of it. The Last Duel is a good movie. This was the first Ridley Scott film that he directed that I liked in a while, because outside of The Martian, everything that Scott did in the previous 15 years, I was not into. Although I never saw All the Money in the World, which I heard was good. But I did like this, and I thought that the last 30 minutes of this, when it gets to the actual duel, was great. At the same time, the movie is too damn long. There are too many moments where the Last Duel is just kind of idling. And it's frustrating because I believe that there is a much better, shorter movie lodged within this movie. I believe that if you took a scalpel and edited out the different perspectives angle of this and just showed everything as it happened, you'd not only get the same story, you'd get a better, shorter, smoother version of it. The Last Duel would have been excellent as a 2-hour film, but beyond that, it becomes harder to recommend. It's hard to recommend any movie with 2 rape scenes where the second one could have been consolidated into the first one. So, overall, The Last Duel, it's good, mostly. It's interesting. It captures a lot of what I liked about the book, and it has some good performances. But there's too much gunk clogging it up. It comes close to being great. It is great at times, but the total package is weighed down more than it needed to be. Not every film with fight sequences needs to be 2.5 hours long, and this one certainly didn't. So, overall, this is the first time I've ever given a rating in a review on this channel, believe it or not. But hey, why not? I, semi-arbitrarily give The Last Duel a 7.92 out of 10. Just below an 8. It's good. If you watch it, you'll probably like it, but it takes up more time than it needs to, in my opinion.